All right, good morning, everyone. We have some folks still joining us from the waiting room, but in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to this first webinar in our 2022 Fall-Winter Science Seminar Series, brought to you by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the Southeast CASC or SE CASC. My name is Carrie Furness, and I'm the Assistant University Director here at the Southeast CASC. And I'm joined today by Kristen Fontana, a Science Communications Fellow here at SE CASC. In these virtual seminars, we're highlighting SE CASC funded projects that support resource management actions across the Southeast. So let me start first by letting you know what to expect from the webinar today. So we'll first go over some simple meeting logistics, request some feedback from you all via a short poll, and then we'll introduce our speaker for today. So she'll present for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for some good Q&A and discussion at the end before we wrap up. So now I'll turn it over to Kristen to give you a quick overview of our webinar technology.
We have this little schematic for you guys to look at. I'm going to quickly cover some of the features of the Zoom interface that we're using for today's webinar. I'm sure many of you guys have used Zoom thus far, so I'm just going to point out a few things. The controls on the bottom left of your Zoom allow you to mute and unmute your audio, as you can see over here. We also ask that you keep yourself muted and your video off so we can reduce distractions during the presentations. In the middle of the bottom bar, you can access the chat window. And I encourage you, if questions come up during the presentation, to submit them in the chat discussion after the talk. We will also be monitoring questions there, and we'll post them to our speaker during the Q&A session. We'll also be recording today's session, and you can access and share the recording afterwards on our website and on the Science Series webpage on our YouTube channel. Now we're going to just launch a short poll, and just to get a bit of information about who is with us today and to help us know how to continue to get information about these seminars. We'll just give you about a half minute or so to fill it out. Thank you guys for filling this out and feeding back this information. It's great to see the breadth of folks here in our audience today, which sets us up for a robust discussion about this research. Now we'll turn over to our presentation. While we'll switch screen sharing, Carrie will introduce our speaker.
Great, yeah. Thanks again, y'all, for filling it out and for reading our newsletter, obviously, because that's where most of you appear to have known about this. So anyway, so while we switch screen sharing, Georgina, if you want to go ahead and start getting your presentation up, I'll introduce our presenter, who I am very pleased to introduce. So Georgina Sanchez, Dr. Georgina Sanchez, was a 2015-2016 Global Change Fellow with the Southeast CASC. And I'm so pleased to welcome her back in this new role as a project PI. So thank you, Georgina, for stepping into SE CASC science more fully after you finished as a Global Change Fellow. So Georgina is currently a research associate with the Center for Geospatial Analytics at NC State University. Her interdisciplinary approach to research bridges land and climate change science, hydrology, and geospatial analytics to address sustainability challenges. Georgina holds a PhD in forestry and environmental resources from NC State University and an MS in biosystems engineering from Michigan State University. So she will be discussing today some research funded by the Southeast CASC. And the title of her presentation, you can see, is Improving Projections of Societal Responses to Sea Level Rise and Frequent Flooding. So now we'll turn it over to you, Georgina.
Awesome, but things are looking good now. Very, very happy to be here. Thanks everyone for joining. And thank you, Carrie, for your introduction. I missed it, but I'm sure it was great. Okay, my goal for today is to highlight how we can use storylines and scenarios to consider the known and unknown factors that influence human migration and development patterns. Specifically, I'm going to focus on scenarios of urban growth and how we can apply them to help decision makers better understand the trade-offs between development, conservation, and adaptation choices. You will also hear me talking about a couple of studies that our research team has done to understand the impacts of flood management policies on development patterns, and then how we can use this information to better support our scenario development efforts. So let me start right in. Maybe. There you go. So most of us, we drive to work, we drive to dinner, we drive to meet our friends. We have car-dependent lives and economies that require limitless supplies of land and resources. And in many cases, this has led to unsustainable development patterns of growth that fragment habitat, they degrade our air, water, soil quality, and they alter hydrology. So being able to anticipate future land change has become critical to support land management decisions, planning decisions, decisions like where do we want to develop and how do we want to do so in order to protect important ecosystems. Our research team has worked to develop, and we continue improving a land change model called Futures. Futures was designed to address the ecological and environmental impacts of urbanization. With Futures, we can then simulate spatially and temporally explicit patterns of development that consider site suitability, per capita land consumption, and urban form. And as you can see here in this conceptual framework, there are 3 core submodels that help us then explain where, how much, and the shapes and patterns of newly developed, newly projected development, and how all of this affects land change outcomes. All right, here I am displaying a simulation output. We are looking at the city of Jacksonville. This is Florida. This visualization is projecting urban growth under a business as usual trajectory of growth. We see those orange patches that emerge across the landscape that is simulated annual development running from 2020 through 2050. This is a simulation output, but just a single simulation output. The Futures is a probabilistic model. So we compute hundreds of iterations like this to project then what would be the future trends and patterns. So most of what we can see here, most of what we can anticipate for this area are open spaces, natural lands, working lands, all converted for developed uses. And this conversion of land directly modifies ecosystems. It affects ecological functions, and the effects are long-lasting. The ecological impacts of urbanization, it's a problem that we know that it's especially relevant across the Southeast, where we have low-density urban sprawling as the dominant form of development. Here in this example, I am visualizing development probability by the end of the century. Again, this estimate is computed using Futures. Our projections for a middle-of-the-road socioeconomic scenario suggest about a 13% increase in the size of the urban footprint required to house then an additional 36 million residents for this region. Futures is, I mentioned this, a probabilistic model. So to show you a bit of what I mean by this, here I'm zooming into Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh is the second most populated city in the state. Here I'm displaying probability projections, urban probability projections for Wake County. And as you can see, there are a lot of darker colors in this map representing higher levels of projected development probability. This is basically telling us that it is more likely than not that this area will continue experiencing rapid growth. And well, it is critical to understand the regional scale impacts of urbanization. We also want to understand that urban growth can take on very different forms and structures, and that they can modify ecosystems in very different ways. And our simulations really help us to explicitly capture these, the local characteristics of urban structures from compact patterns of high density development, like the figure that I'm displaying here, to fragmented leapfrog patterns. Again, I'm providing a figure just to exemplify what I mean by that, your typical urban sprawling landscape. Yeah. Now, let me dive into what could be urbanization's projected toll on important ecosystems and working lands. And these projections assume that historical trends are to continue. So your business as usual scenario of growth. Here we have percentage land loss to projected urban expansion by 2100. I am going to break down this a little bit more, but we can see these projections are summarized by state, and I'm presenting a couple of relevant ecosystems. So we have forest laws, we have cultivated and pasture land laws, and we have projections also for wetland laws. All right, let's break this down a bit more. We see that the states with the highest projected forest laws are North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. This potential threat to forested lands could impact not just carbon budgets, but also water resources. We know that forests are important ecosystems that provide services to cleaner water and control water quantity as well. Florida is another interesting case. We see an overall highest projected loss of cultivated and forest lands, which is around 5%. And of course, more development in wetlands, which may result in more people and assets exposed to the increasing threat of flooding, as these ecosystems provide critical flood protection services. Now, let me stop here just for a second to consider human flood interactions. We continue observing vast expansion of development across areas that are prone to flooding, with no sign that communities are truly going to break this cycle. We keep on reading on the news how floods are the leading cause of natural disaster damages. Of course, right now we have a tropical storm. I'm blanking on the name, but we have right now a tropical storm, the storm hitting the coast of Florida that will affect us. And we know that climate change and sea level rise will only aggravate this issue, providing us then with an opportunity to understand past patterns and project alternative scenarios of growth that may be resilient to the increasing threat of flooding. So let me show you a couple of examples now of where our research team is using big data analytics to understand past trends, and then use this information to rethink how we could consider environmental stressors such as flooding, how we can then use this information to simulate projections of urban growth that consider risk and adaptive response. Recently, we investigated where flood damage is more prevalent and what are the underlying drivers that explain why some areas are more likely to experience the basically any type of damage, from loss and injury of human life to damage to infrastructure or impacts to economic and agricultural production, basically any type of economic disruption. And this is work led by our PhD student, Alyssa Collins. Alyssa used several geospatial predictors and actual reports of flood damage to train a random forest model that predicts flood damage probability across the nation. She used data compiled by NOAA, as I'm showing here, with records from 2006 and all the way through 2020. The map on the right side of this figure then displays the density of those reported events, all associated with riverine and flash flooding. So you can see that darker tones of blue represent higher density of reported events. Now we have the graph on the left side of this figure, where you can see predictors used, and they are ordered by relative importance. So anything from where damage was reported relative to the floodplain, to the type of land use, land cover, to climate, elevation, topography, all sorts of relevant predictors. And here we have the final product. Yeah, this is a wall-to-wall estimate of flood damage probability. What we are looking at is estimates of flood damage probability values for each and every single 100-meter pixel across the lower 48 states. So here we really get a comprehensive view and detailed view of the likelihood that any given location will experience damage. And of course, if we get closer, then we can see better understand what's going on here. Yeah, so I'm zooming into New Orleans, where you can clearly see how damage probability varies across the landscape. This information can be used for planners to better understand damage probability. And of course, it can also be used by communities themselves to better make decisions to protect themselves. And to understand the regional patterns, we can explore also flood damage probability at the county and state levels, both showing hotspots of high flood damage probability estimates that are prevalent across the Southeast and Midwest of the US. All right, this analysis highlighted an interesting fact. We found that a great majority of the observed damage reports were located outside of designated areas by FEMA, designated high-risk areas by FEMA. So next, what we decided to do was to basically investigate what might be going on here. So the next research study that I'm going to share is where our team aims to uncover what could be going on here. And we started by taking a closer look at FEMA's designation of high-risk flood zones, also known as the 100-year floodplain, or areas where there is a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. Here we have Lake Raleigh. This is Centennial Campus. If you are in Raleigh, if you're in NC State, then this area should look very familiar to you. Coloring cyan, then we see areas inside the floodplain, and with those red dashes, you can see waterways and you can see the lake itself. And there is a range of users for this type of data, from planners to natural resource managers to landowners, all whom rely on these maps to make decisions, again, about where to develop and how to do so. For example, we can use this information to help determine whether an area requires flood insurance, or if it has restrictions on development, or even if it is eligible for federal buyout programs. What we're also observing in this figure is that there is an inside versus outside characterization of flood risk. Land and built infrastructure that sits outside of the floodplain is considered to have minimal risk, regardless of whether it stands a foot or a mile outside of the floodplain, and therefore it is not subjected to protective regulations. But in reality, we know that flood risk doesn't really abruptly stop at the edge of the floodplain. It varies across the landscape and in proximity to the floodplain. So we think that this in versus out characterization of risk might be misleading communities about their true risk and encouraging development adjacent to the floodplain, which could then help us explain why there is so much damage reported outside of flood zones. So our goal for this project was to investigate the impacts of flood management policies on development patterns, specifically the regulatory 100-year floodplain, which is what I'm displaying on this map. We know that there's the great majority of highly populated areas do have flood maps available, and those are areas colored in gray on this map, but about 40% of the nation lacks FEMA flood maps, mostly rural communities. And here, we also see the actual flood map color in black. So Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, most definitely stand out. So we took on the task to assess the spatial distribution of development patterns inside along the edge and outside of the floodplain boundary by classifying areas with available FEMA maps, with available FEMA coverage based on their proximity to the edge of the floodplain, to the edge of the boundary itself. So we calculated the distance from the edge of the floodplain in 250-meter wide concentric buffer zones and all the way up to 2 kilometers. So you can see here in the legend that I'm displaying how we estimated locations that were anywhere between 0 to 250 meters, 250 to 500, 500 to 750, and so on, as the distance proximity to the edge of the floodplain. And then areas that are in the lighter tone of blue in this map represent locations that are more than 2 kilometers, 2 kilometers away from the edge of the floodplain. And just for reference, 250 meters is 820 feet, or roughly the length of 2 square city blocks. Then we evaluated where development stands with regard to each one of these distance zones. And you can see color in orange here in areas that are classified as developed land. And this is information from the National Land Cover Database. Here we have our full workflow for this study. As you can see, we quantified the extent and the spatial distribution of both current and future development. Again, projections coming from the futures model. And all of this with regard to these different distance zones. And then we summarize findings at the county level and the state level. Let's again take a closer look to better understand what is going on here. So this is right at the Missouri-Illinois border. Here we have Cape Girardeau. We see again the map 100-year floodplain in dark blue. And now we see the concentric distance zones. So the closer, or if you're inside the floodplain, is the darker tone of blue, and buffer zones that are in closer proximity are in darker tones of blue. Buffer zones that are farther away from the floodplain then are in lighter tones. And again, we have areas that are classified as developed land. For Cape Girardeau, we can clearly see then the spatial distribution of this community along the floodplain. Now, when we look at total developed land area, for each distance zone and at the county level, we found a nationwide trend of concentrated development in zones immediately adjacent to the floodplain. And as you can see in this graph, we examined that distribution of development for 2 time periods, 2001 and 2019. There is a significantly greater concentration of development right at the edge of the floodplain when compared to the mean amount of developed land area that it's either inside of the floodplain or in any other of the distance zones beyond the 250-meter mark. And here, of course, we have future projections of development. What we observe is that if no policies are put in place to address this issue, then our simulations show that this trend is likely to continue. We will continue seeing concentrated growth in close proximity to the floodplain boundary. State level development trends are also very insightful. And we see the same exact signal. Total developed land increases from the farthest to the closest distance zones. And of course, the peak at the 250-meter buffer is more evident for some states than others. And Florida most definitely stands out, Georgia, Texas. And keep in mind that this is absolute developed land, so total absolute developed land. So of course, states that are larger in size and more developed will see greater values. We have an inside versus outside characterization of flood risk that could be misleading communities about their true risk. And as I demonstrated here, this could be encouraging development adjacent to the floodplain, which may cause greater damages when flood events exceed planned levels, like the 100-year return event. And this is one of the possible reasons why we observe so much reported damage outside of high-risk flood zones. There are other well-known reasons why we observe this. Of course, the fact that a lot of the floodplain maps are outdated and they don't really account for climate and land change conditions. And of course, I show you how we have about 40% of the nation that is lacking any type of regulatory flood risk information. Now, people are becoming more aware of the increased risk of flooding associated both with climate change and sea level rise, and they will respond to this threat. We see more and more communities and planners adapting to mitigate risk. The challenge here is that our models and our future scenarios should also consider how communities are adapting and responding to the increasing threat of flooding. So again, our research team took on the task to basically accomplish exactly this. The final research project that I want to share with you today is about our team's effort to model the interaction between urban growth, increased flooding, and human adaptive response. With the latest version of Futures Now, we can address questions like, are communities, our coastal communities and flood-prone communities prepare to absorb future shocks and bounce forward? And are inland communities prepared to receive climate migrants? Futures version 3 now integrates user-specified scenarios to represent community preferences or policy influences in response to flooding, like encouraging retreat from high-risk areas, or promoting infrastructural adaptations, or implementing nature-based solutions, all used to reduce exposure. I show you a version of this graph before, Futures conceptual framework. Here you can see how we develop and integrate a brand new climate forcing submodel. This submodel was designed to estimate the probability that a developed location will experience flood damage and its likely adaptation response. At the core of the climate forcing submodel, we have a customizable flood response function to capture the range of human behaviors likely for specific areas. We are able to capture an array of alternative scenarios of what may happen under different assumptions or political conditions or economic conditions. We are now able to calculate a site-specific adaptive response based on three parameters: local estimates of flood probability, the level of damage, and adaptive capacity. And our advanced framework can now assist us in simulating three response states: retreat, protect, and trapped, the ones that I'm displaying in the figure right now. For example, we see that blue dot on the flood response function. It is representing highly resilient locations experiencing a moderate level of damage following a flood event. Residents at this location are assumed to be able to enact protections like elevating their homes or building a levee, anything basically to reduce their exposure and keep water out. Now we have this other purple dot in the flood response function. It represents a location where residents experience the same level of moderate damage, but they are in the vulnerable side of the adaptive capacity spectrum. So it is assumed that they will be forced to retreat. And again, so we see how the flood response function directly modifies or directly guides what response states happen for every different location in our study system. They will either retreat, trapped, or protect. Okay, now let me demonstrate how everything really works here. So I'm going to dive into the Charleston metropolitan area This is coastal South Carolina, a low-lying region experiencing a rapid urbanization, where we know that the natural and coastal ecosystems are threatened by the coastal squeeze, or this compound pressure from sea level rise and urban development. So this is the perfect location to really understand the interactions between flooding and adaptive response. Here we have a simulation output from the new version of Futures. You will see that there is a lot more going on here than the initial simulation that I show you. We are now able to account for this matrix of push and pull factors, like residents retreating an area as their response to flooding. And these are areas colored in purple on the map. You can also see that we have population and economic growth driving increasing the demand for development. And those are those orange patches that emerge across the landscape that are representing a new development or projected new development. Now, both processes, as you can see, are simulated in concert. For this example, we are looking at a scenario that represents a reactive response. So we are assuming that residents adapt to threats as needed. In this case, again, the threat is flooding. We are not simulating any specific incentive or policy to minimize exposure or damage. Now, you are asking yourself, well, whatever happens with the other response states, whatever happened with stay trap, protect, and what we are looking at retreat. So here we have the full picture of all interactive processes. Simulated new development as well as retreat, protect, and trapped. So the result for this projection is that highly resilient communities are more likely to stay in place by enacting in situ adaptation measures, while vulnerable communities are likely to either retreat or stay trapped. And this is because of the high social and economic cost of migration and adaptation. Trapped residents are those characterized by a lack of resources, and they may only migrate if or when their lives are threatened by a flood event. How the response function is parameterized will directly determine the simulated amount of people and developed land exposed to the risk of flooding. I just show you our simulations for that reactive response function that assumes that residents across the Charleston metropolitan area will adapt to flooding as needed. But we can construct this function to be representative of a number of conditions based on a body of literature. So we use past studies that have explained adaptive response to environmental stressors. And our goal here was to develop a response function that could be transferred across geographies and conditions. But do please keep in mind that this framework is very flexible. We can refine the function and parameters to better represent local realities using input from communities through co-production and participatory modeling methods. And we can have other scenarios like what I'm displaying here. Let's say we have an strategic relocation policy where all residents from a community are experiencing damage, that may be experiencing damage above a certain threshold, are provided the resources to retreat. Or a scenario where residents of all levels of adaptive capacity are highly resistant to retreat, and therefore resources are used to keep water out through, let's say, green or gray infrastructure projects, for example. Now, allow me to continue with the same case implementation for the Charleston metropolitan area. Here I'm comparing exposure to future flooding for then 5 response scenarios. And my goal here is not really to dive into the specifics for each one of these response scenarios. You can see that I have included the reactive, resist, and strategic relocation that we talked about. But what I really want to do here is to demonstrate the application and the power of scenario analysis. So this graph shows the percentage change in total developed land exposed to flooding. And these are estimates relative to current conditions. Let me walk you through everything that is going on here. We see two time steps, projections by 2035 and by 2050. And on the x-axis, we have different annual flood probabilities from less recurrent to more frequent flood events. Values above 0 represent more developed land exposed to future flooding, again, relative to current conditions. And values below 0, it's exactly the opposite. Lower exposure when compared to current estimates. Basically, the strategic relocation scenario is the only one that would result in lower exposure compared to today's estimates. And the exact opposite effect was found for the resist scenario, where we see a greater flood risk as climate changes and the urban footprint expands. Here, the power truly lies in our ability to compare between the scenarios and other alternative scenarios and really evaluate competing needs from natural resource managers and urban planning perspectives. And of course, incorporating the perceptions of the communities and local residents themselves. We want to support decision makers and residents from at-risk communities in visualizing resilient scenarios where they can understand the trade-offs between development, conservation, and adaptation choices that make sense for their community. And as I'm getting ready to wrap up here, but before I do that, I'm gonna go back to one of my previous questions. Are destination communities prepared to receive climate migrants? Our recent modeling advances can also help us consider where displaced residents may relocate. For our Charleston metropolitan case implementation, our predictions show that most residents are expected to retreat, will likely relocate within the same county or in counties nearby. But they could also relocate as far west as Washington State or California, Oregon, as you can see in the visualization. Climate change brings complex challenges to our communities. And while today I focus on flood risk, our modeling framework is flexible and we are able to integrate other environmental stressors such as drought, fire, extreme heat. We can see on this map how different stressors are more relevant in different regions across the nation. And the idea then is then to be able to integrate all of them at some point. Scenario analysis allows us to back planning and decision-making with science and local knowledge. We can work together with communities to tailor simulations and scenarios that match their local capacity. And at the same time, we can work with state and federal agencies to understand regional impacts of rapid growth. You hear me talking about 4 different research projects. This body of work would not have been possible without the wonderful group of people that I get to work with and collaborate with when thinking about land change and climate interactions. I want to acknowledge our full research team right here, as well as thank the support from our sponsors, which of course include SE CASC and Sea Grant. And thank you much for this invitation, and I am happy to take questions. I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
That's great. Thank you, Georgina. That was a huge body of work that I'm sure there's a lot of questions and discussions about. So I'll open the floor. I would suggest that if you have a question, feel free to use your reaction bar down at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand and we can call on you to ask it out, or type it into the chat and we can read it out for Georgina to respond to. So I'll stop for a minute and see if anyone Just to raise their hand. It looks like we have Melinda. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hello.
I really enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to ask, when you're looking at these local communities affected, are you looking at their socio-economic status as well, or is that something, I know it's like slightly different, but
Yes, no, we do. And it was very important for us to be able to characterize basically local adaptive capacity. And we did that. Right now we're integrating the CDC Social Vulnerability Index as a metric of how vulnerable or resilient communities are. So this index do bring a couple of socioeconomic parameters and disparity parameters that help us then break down what locations may have then the tools to either adapt or retreat. Or then it also helps us identify what areas might be at the highest level of vulnerability, where they really don't have many options. And then that's the type of agent that we refer as trapped communities.
I have an additional question, if that's okay.
Sure.
When you were talking about climate migrants, how did you predict where these communities might go to? Is just like looking at patterns already observed, or?
Great question. So right now what we're doing is we're using IRS records. So every time you file your taxes, you have to report in what county you are. And we have estimates that go back to, I want to say 1985. And we are able then to understand the probability that any one resident from any one county might relocate to any other county within the nation. So within county relocation or between county relocation. Keep in mind though, that this is based on past trends. So this is what we have observed in the past. So it's really important to consider that in the future, because of climate change, we will see that some areas might be more amenable in terms of their local weather, their local climate. So more people might decide to go here and avoid areas that are more likely to experience not just flooding, but fire, extreme heat. So this data is not able to really help us with this idea of future migration. But that's the next step. That's what we're working on right now, to try to have a more climate aware migration decision matrix, because we use a decision matrix for this.
Thank you.
But yes, great question.
Great, thanks. Thomas, would you like to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Georgina. Thanks for the great talk. I'm a second-year PhD student in civil engineering who studies coastal flooding driven by sea level rise. So this was all really interesting to me.
Awesome.
Could you talk a little bit more about how you could incorporate community adaptation capacity and preferences into your model outcomes? What would that process look like?
Great question. So among our collaborators are also great folks that dive into participatory modeling, and experts and then are able to work with communities to shape what could be the parameters that we use then to inform these models. So for example, if we work close with communities and we know that they prefer green infrastructure or nature-based solutions to be the adaptive response for their communities, or we can response function to account for maybe local desires to reduce risk for the most vulnerable communities. So we can really bring communities' perspective to reimagine completely how adaptation will happen. What I show you here are either scenarios that are that we have observed in the past, or of course policies that we keep on hearing about, like managed retreat. But the idea and the goal, the ultimate goal that we want to do is then, now we have the framework, let's bring it to communities. Let's make sure that we are redesigning the flood response function so that we capture local realities. And
Uh-oh. I think we just lost Georgina.
Yeah,
And
hopefully she'll come back soon.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm not quite certain what's happening on campus with that internet.
Yeah.
Let me just see. Well, while we wait for her to come back on, because I obviously am not competent to answer the questions. Although I don't know if anybody else from the team, I saw Ross come on, might be interested to weigh in on some of these questions, but why don't we go ahead and show give some information about our next seminar, and then hopefully we'll, by the time we finish with that, Georgina will have gotten back on. We wanted to let you know about our next seminar in this fall winter science seminar series, which will be a presentation on the Southeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, the Southeast Risk, which is part of some national risk programs as well. That's going to be given by the Southeast CASC PIs, Brett Sheffers, Dia Lawrence, and Wes Daniels from University of Florida and USGS respectively, on December 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern. So the details for registration are on our website, and if you get our newsletter, you'll see it coming up in our next newsletter as well with information about that. And Kristen has put the link in the chat. I hope you'll be able to join us for that seminar. And then finally, just wanted to let you know that by registering for today's webinar, you'll also be subscribed to our newsletter if you aren't already, where you'll be able to learn more about these upcoming seminars and other events. And of course, you're welcome to unsubscribe at any time, though we hope not, but it looks like Georgina is back with us. So yeah, we'll spotlight Georgina back again and let her continue. Thanks.
Yes, apologies about that. I don't know why Zoom keeps on kicking me out. First time ever that happens.
Yeah, it's
of course.
unfortunate. Thank you for persisting.
No, how long was I out?
It was a few minutes, enough time that we did the wrap up, and now we're coming back. So it worked out fine.
Right, I realized I actually kept on talking and then realized that it kicked me out.
Okay. Well, you were partway through your response to Thomas's question.
So Tom, how far off did I left it?
I think you had almost wrapped up talking about participatory modeling and getting input from communities that way.
Yes, exactly it. So anything else you would like me to elaborate on that? Or sorry, I really don't know where, at what point he kicked me out.
No, that was great. I'm thinking about doing some participatory modeling as well. So cool to hear that other people are taking that track. Thank you.
Fantastic. If you send me an email, I can also connect you to folks that are doing fantastic work on that area as well.
Yeah, right. And yeah, we will hope to be able to pass on your contact information to folks after this, Georgina.
Sure, absolutely.
So it's a C. Olson. I'm not sure what the first name is, so I will, but if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yes. Have you considered how your analyses might change or be adjusted if FEMA were to raise their elevation limits on the 100-year flood, say 2 meters or 4 meters higher or whatever? And then if developers were required to follow suit and, do this, and then what would happen to your need to have people move or adopt or some of these other considerations? I think it would be interesting to look at that if the FEMA 100-year flood elevation was changed.
Right. So if we change the science standards, by default, we'll see different patterns, especially in the study that I share where we examine the distribution of built environments with regard to the floodplain. If we were to have more extreme standards, let's say instead of considering the 100-year floodplain, we consider the 500-year floodplain, or if we were to update our understanding of flood risk by introducing either climate or land change into the equation, we will see definitely that things will have to change. How that will happen, and if developers will have to change the way that they build, that's I guess a question for a different person. But you are more likely to see at least that trend of a lot of damage, reported damage outside of high risk areas, that is likely to change if we were to change our design standards. Now, and as everything, it's gonna take a lot of time. We currently have a lot of built environment in very close to the floodplain, if not inside of it. So that's a process that will take several years to happen. That's a really good question.
Yeah, well, also, the IPCC and national climate assessments have shown that sea level rise isn't the same everywhere. And a lot of these coastal areas, a 2, 4, or 8 foot or meter difference in what's considered the possibility of a 100-year flood could make a huge difference. And it would be really great to see an analysis, because that would then have some hard data behind suggesting that, hey, you know, we can't have developers working in this area anymore.
Exactly, you're exactly right. And even if we think of what would be the 100-year floodplain 30 years ago and what it could be in 30 years from today, those are going to be very different in terms of like the spatial distribution. So we can't really compare them as apple to apples. What we could do then is integrate those climate forcings into how we estimate flood risk, to then have what would be the, let's say, quote unquote, real conditions for the 100-year return period today, or in 10, 20, 30 years from today. So those layers should not be static. It should be a dynamic model where we consider how land and climate is directly affecting flood risk.
Okay, thank you.
Sure thing.
I'll leave the floor open, but I'll chime in with a question too, sort of related to that. So do you see that the work that you guys have done on that sort of probability of flood damage in relation to those the flood zones can actually feed into those calculations of, you know, I mean, can that information get back to FEMA such that they could actually adjust the flood zone mapping in response to the fact that, you know, the projections are that those floodplains are changing? The damage is outside of what the currently projected floodplains are.
Yeah, well, right. That's something that we can do. We can think of an more like an iterative modeling framework, where we take new observation of damages, reported damage, to then inform what was our prediction of what areas should be at risk and which ones are less likely to be at risk. So that's a more data-driven approach, but we can definitely adjust.
Oh my heavens. Did we lose her again?
Seems like it.
Gee whiz. There's a loose cable on campus.
Must be.
Well, I think given that we're 5 minutes from the top of the hour, I hate for Georgina to keep needing to bounce back in here, but maybe we'll go ahead and concede defeat. And yeah, okay, so we'll take it. If you have other questions, how about this? Go ahead and throw them in the chat, and we'll pass them on to Georgina and then ask her to follow up with those. So I'll leave the Zoom open for a bit until the end, until we get to the top of the hour. Georgina's back. Okay, maybe she will. Georgina, are you back with us again?
Yes.
I don't know what in the
I
world.
love how this is the first time that this ever happens.
Yeah.
I don't even know what it was.
Yeah. There's a gremlin in the Ethernet on campus, but
yes,
I was, so my question was really more, can FEMA actually, is this actionable for the people who actually define the flood maps? But yeah, I think you've sort of answered that.
Well, and I would hope so. I would hope that this type of research, as well as the body of work that others help us improve our estimates of risk and what FEMA is currently doing on the ground.
Yeah.
On the ground.
Yeah. absolutely. Yeah, I'm not sure what their cycle is. Yeah, and there's a question in the chat that says that these are powerful data. Thank you for your presentation. I think we can all agree on that comment. But if the data are available, can you share a link to those data?
Yes, we work under an open science framework. Our research team, we're very much about sharing not just the data, but in many cases the code. For instance, for futures, the code is open and the model can be freely accessed through GraphGIS. And that being said, some of the products are already available at different public repositories. If you send me an email, because I'm not very good multitasking, but if you send me an email, I'll put my email in the chat. I can definitely share, for instance, the flood damage probability estimates are currently living on the USGS science-based platform, and you can get that data, download that data for the lower 48 states. And other projections, futures projections as well. We have some open repositories that I'm happy to share. And we're also working on a new repository, again, supported by USGS, using their science-based platform to share access to future projections. But that's on the works right now, but it will be out very soon, before the end of the year.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so I'll reiterate, as a CCASC funded and USGS funded project, the data will be publicly available in the data repository for USGS. So Georgina, maybe I could pull together some of this information and then follow up with all the folks who are registered with details, with any follow-up links to resources and your email for follow-up if you're okay with that.
Absolutely. I'm typing my email in the chat right now.
Well,
not really. I don't think it's not even allowing me to type anything on the chat.
We'll pop that in there, but then we can also follow up with it. Might be easier, and then we can include these resources and other links. Sorry about the gremlins in the machine. Because the other question has come up as whether there's any raster or shapefile products that are going to be publicly available. So I think we've answered that.
Yes, the answer is yes.
Oh, there you go. It came through. Joseph, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and say this. This is going to be the last question, but I think we can pass this on to Georgina for follow-up as well. I'll go ahead and read it. To take a look at Babcock Ranch. I'll go ahead, Joseph.
No, I just wanted to share. I'm in Florida, the Orlando area, but there is a development that's been going on for a few years. But they've interesting that the developer has taken a completely systems approach, completely different approach than standard development, where even the roadways, if the system itself in this town is overwhelmed, the flooding is overwhelmed in this town, the roads have been designed to act as rivers to take things out. It's just really what they've done, the levels of what they've done. It's really a model, but basically they were in the direct path of Ian and Southwest Florida, and a lot of stuff was pretty much devastated over there, and that town didn't budge. So it's just an interesting example for folks if they want to take a look at that. Thanks.
Absolutely. Well, that's the reality of so many communities even today. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so I guess we will go ahead and come to conclusion here. And I want to say thanks to everybody for joining us, and for thanks especially to Georgina for this great presentation and for your persistence and continuing to try to interact with the audience.
Thank you everyone for sticking all the way through the end, even with like how many times they kicked me out? 3 maybe?
I think it was a record. I'm pretty sure. Anyways, thanks again, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll do some follow-up afterwards. So
wonderful. Right. Thank you everyone.
Take care, y'all.
Thanks, Gary.
Bye-bye.